Hey everybody. So when I make a review on my channel, I normally follow a fairly simple structure where I give a blurb about what the game is, what platforms it's on, what its current release status is, and what its reception was on launch, and maybe some additional information about if I have a personal connection to it or not, or what kinds of questions I might be looking to answer with the review, and then from there I start talking about presentation, so visuals, audio, and performance, and then after that I talk about the story, and then I talk about the gameplay, and then I summarize everything at the very end with a review score that is sort of a capstone. It summarizes the general intent behind the review into a fairly straightforward format where I have a specific scale that I follow, and people misrepresent the scale constantly, which is always really annoying, because they're always operating on IGN logic, where anything less than a 9 out of 10 is apparently saying that the game is atrocious, and that is just not how my scale operates. But anyway, point is that I have that format that I follow, and I might mess around with that format a bit here and there, depending on the game. For example, if there's barely any story to talk about, or there's a lot to talk about in story, I might actually talk about gameplay first, and then talk about story later. Just depends on the situation. But the general structure is quite consistent. That is not what this video is going to be. As you can tell from the title, from the thumbnail, and from what I am saying now, this is my, I guess you can call it, review of Doom: The Dark Ages, because it does fit the main criterion I have for whether one of my videos is a review or a different type of video, like a My Thoughts on video or a Games That Infuriate Me to No End or something like that. Which is that I refuse to call one of my videos a review unless I have finished the game in question. Played through it from start to finish, seen the ending, so on and so forth. In the case of things like multiplayer games or games with very heavy multiplayer components, then that gets a bit trickier to determine when I'm actually in a completed state for the game. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have completed 100% of it. It means that I have completed any kind of single-player campaign that it has, completed the entire storyline of it, and I have progressed far enough with multiplayer gameplay that I have a very good grasp of what the mechanics are and what kind of progression system it has, if it even has one at all, that sort of thing. And now that I've said all of that, you're probably wondering where this video fits into the categorization on my channel, because if I label it a My Thoughts on video, or a Games That Infuriate Me to No End, or something like that, the implication is that I did not finish the game. Whereas if I label it a review, the implication is that I'm going to stick to my standard structure that I normally go with. The thing is that Doom: The Dark Ages falls into this very odd space where I have finished the game, and yet I really don't feel like making a video in the structured review style for it, so what this video will ultimately be is following more of a Games That Infuriate Me to No End or My Thoughts on format, where it's more freeform, I'm more off the cuff with what I say. I don't script any of my videos anyway, but it's even more obvious that I don't in those types of videos than when I do my reviews. They're, again, a lot more structured in reviews. But at the end, I am still going to give a score summary of it, because technically this is still a review, because I finished Doom: The Dark Ages. It's just not going to be in that typical structured format. So why is that? Well, there's only a few important points to hit with Doom: The Dark Ages. The first I will go ahead and talk about is performance. And that is because this game runs on the latest version of the id Tech engine, the same version of the engine that powers Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, or at least a very similar version to it. Obviously, the Indiana Jones version was tweaked a bit by Machine Games. But the big thing you need to understand about this iteration of the id Tech engine is that ray tracing is forced on the player. You have no way of turning it off, and that means that the minimum requirement is at least a 20 series NVIDIA card, or the equivalent from AMD. Now, I have an RTX 3080 12GB model. Obviously not the latest and greatest by any stretch of the imagination, but to be fair, the latest from NVIDIA is the 50 series cards, and they're just a complete joke as far as performance goes, especially considering their pricing. But compared to, say, the 40 series cards, it's still no slouch, and is still a very capable card for the resolution I game at, which is 1080p. And with the graphics settings maxed out, the frame rate fluctuates pretty wildly between the low 40s, sometimes even below that on occasion, all the way up to about 100 sometimes, but most of the time it's somewhere between about 45 and 65 FPS, meaning that it's playable but doesn't really feel all that great. Now, of course, for some extra context, the rest of my components are a Ryzen 9 5900X and 64 gigs of RAM. Again, your mileage is going to vary depending on what your individual hardware is, but as long as you're running a mid to high-end PC, you shouldn't really have too much difficulty running this thing on reasonably high graphics settings. You might have to lower a few settings here and there to smooth out the frame rate to the point where it's at 60 FPS plus at all times. But unless you're running a low-end 20 series card, I feel like you probably won't have too many difficulties running this thing at a playable frame rate, as long as you're willing to sacrifice some visuals, and as long as the rest of your hardware isn't bottlenecking your system. That said, the RT requirement is definitely a problem here, because there are a lot of people still running cards that are not capable of ray tracing. So that helps to explain why sales have been kind of crap for this game. Granted, it also doesn't help that the game is available on Game Pass and was available from day one, and that's actually how I played it. I played through this using Game Pass because I didn't feel like spending $70 US for it. That is quite a bit to ask for a first-person shooter that's about a dozen hours long, depending on your difficulty setting and whether you're going for secrets and such like that. Thus, Game Pass, at least at this time, with the price of the game being $70 US or whatever your regional equivalent is the considerably more attractive option for people who can actually play this game at all. This, in turn, severely cuts into the game's sales, and, well, sales are the primary metric by which we judge whether a game was successful or not. Because with Game Pass and subscription services in general, it's only getting some of the money from your subscription, and not a whole lot of it, really. Whereas direct purchases are obviously a lot more lucrative. And no matter how often developers and publishers tout the number of players they have reached, ultimately it's how many copies sold, how much money the game made back on its investment, how much of a profit it ultimately made, that is going to determine whether or not the game was a success. Or, if it didn't manage to make its investment back and didn't manage to turn a profit, then it was ultimately not a success. So right now, with Doom: The Dark Ages having released earlier this year, it remains to be seen whether the game will ultimately be considered a success or not. I really don't think it's going to be, considering the impact of Game Pass and the impact of game pricing in general these days. But who knows, at this point the numbers simply aren't in yet. Now then, all of that said, with the performance out of the way, with the Game Pass discussion out of the way for now, we'll come back to it a bit later. What about the actual game itself? Well, some of you might be expecting me to talk heavily about the story, because they really tried to push the story in this, even compared to Doom Eternal, which already pushed the story too much. I will be fair here, you can skip the cutscenes, which is nice, because what passes for a story in NuDOOM is really frickin' stupid. And in Doom: The Dark Ages in particular, it is especially stupid. The timeline of the Doom series at this point is just a complete disaster. I'm not even going to attempt to figure out what is supposed to take place when and how it all fits together, because there's no point in it anyway. Like Carmack himself said, the story is expected to be there, but it's really not important. What actually matters is gameplay. And yet, modern id Software seems to have completely forgotten that very simple rule, and have instead delved heavily into scripted sequences and cutscenes, and it just gets very tiresome very quickly. So most of the cutscenes I actually just ended up skipping through because I didn't care to begin with, and what pitiful excuse of story was being presented was so lazy, predictable, and dull that I just decided it was better to go ahead and skip the cutscenes and just get right to the gameplay. And the experience was, funnily enough, actually better for it, because at least I didn't have to put up with the god-awful fanfiction tier writing at that point. And the especially funny part about this is that you don't need the cutscenes to understand what the story is. You're playing as they call him these days, the Doomslayer, but I will always continue to refer to him as Doom Guy, because that's what I've always known him as. But you're playing as Doom Guy, and he really hates hell and the forces of hell, so you're just there to fight the forces of hell, and that's it. You're just this immensely powerful rage golem. Go fight the demons. That is all Doom has ever been. You are the one lone badass. Go fight the forces of hell. That is all you have ever needed to know, and that is all you ever will need to know about Doom. And anyone trying to argue otherwise is simply wrong. Doom does not need lore. It does not benefit from lore. Stop trying to make lore happen. Anyway, to sum that up, pitiful excuse of a story, it doesn't matter anyway, just skip the cutscenes, you'll be better off for it regardless. And thankfully they give you the option of skipping the cutscenes instead of doing what the 2016 reboot did, where you couldn't skip the cutscenes. That was incredibly obnoxious. Thankfully you could skip them in this, and you could skip them in Eternal, but you couldn't skip all of them in Eternal. You can skip all the cutscenes in Doom the Dark Ages. So definitely an improvement over Eternal in that regard. Anyway, moving past story and cutscenes, what about the gameplay? Because that is always what has mattered for Doom, and this game is no exception in that regard. Well, at a glance, you can easily tell that it is in the same general gameplay continuum as the 2016 reboot and Doom Eternal, where the first-person shooting part of this supposed first-person shooter is really just to get enemies into a stagger state so you can finish them off with melee finishers. The big difference with that in the Dark Ages compared to the previous two games, however, is that in the previous two games you had what are referred to as glory kills, which were canned animations that would play when you would go to finish an enemy off, wherein you would quite literally rip and tear until it is done, as in, you would just tear demons apart with your bare hands and just smash the crap out of them. Thing is, while individually those animations might be kinda neat to look at, in the course of gameplay they get pretty tiresome pretty quickly, because you're ultimately interrupting your flow of gameplay in order to just sit there and watch a canned animation play out. And it interrupted the flow of gameplay enough that the developers introduced an upgrade you could get in Eternal that would dramatically increase the speed at which you would go through these animations. Well, they decided to take that even further with Doom the Dark Ages, in the sense that you don't get glory kill animations anymore. You just either bonk them with your shield, or bonk them with your melee weapon, or you kick them. And that's it. You can only actually get a finisher animation in the style of a glory kill in certain very specific instances where you basically just fall onto an enemy to perform the glory kill, or if you're fighting very specific enemies that are basically boss-type enemies that will allow you to increase your health, armor, and ammo capacities. Now, the funny thing about reducing almost the entirety of the glory system down to bonk the enemy is that it reduces something that would wear out its welcome very quickly in the previous two games, but was at least viscerally satisfying, down to just looking a bit silly but not in a fun way in Doom the Dark Ages, and it ends up being really dull. It's just interesting how this has worked out. Clearly they understood that interrupting the flow of gameplay from moment to moment with canned finisher animations does ultimately create a very stop-and-go feeling to the gameplay rather than just everything feeling like one smooth progression, but instead of overhauling the system to something more akin to, say, the way Shadow Warrior 3 handled it, where you would whip out your melee weapon and start attacking enemies and slicing them apart, and that would actually heal you while you were doing that, instead of having to interrupt what you were doing to go through a canned finisher animation, they just decided to stick with the same system and make it worse. And that would be bad enough, but they made it considerably worse by reducing the Berserk power-up down from giving you infinite uses of instant melee finishers like in Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, where you would just really tear enemies apart in particularly gruesome ways. Now it's just, here, have infinite ammo, and you can just melee all of the enemies all the time instead of having to deal with however many melee charges you normally would have. You don't even get the ambient sound effect like you did in, say, Doom 3, where your guy would just be continuously screaming the entire time. Nope, just a pop-up on the screen saying Berserk is active, and, well, you can have infinite ammo and infinite melee attacks now, and the melee attacks insta-kill enemies. To say it is lame is a severe understatement there. But I will be fair in saying that even though they severely nerfed the melee stuff, they did at least buff some of the guns compared to the previous two games. In particular, the super shotgun actually feels powerful again in Doom the Dark Ages. In this game, it can actually do some real damage to enemies, but of course it still just pales in comparison to the super shotgun from Doom 2. And while they do have some cool concepts behind some of the guns that they have on display, like guns that will chew up demonic skulls and spit out the skull shards at enemies, which is just metal as hell, unfortunately, there's a severe imbalance in the way the weapons actually work. Now, like I said, the super shotgun is actually quite powerful. You will see me using it quite a lot during the gameplay footage. What you won't see me using anywhere near as much are most of the other weapons. The only other one you will see me using a lot is the Impaler, which is one of the two spike-launching guns, and more specifically, it's the one that launches the larger, heavier spikes and is basically this game's equivalent of something like the Gauss Cannon in the 2016 reboot or the Ballista in Doom Eternal, but it's not quite the same. In those games, it was very much a hit scan kind of thing, where it would just shoot out basically a laser beam, effectively. It wasn't quite a laser beam. Obviously, a Gauss gun is launching a projectile at insanely high speeds. But anyway, point is, it occupies the same general purpose in the arsenal. It's just that now you have to compensate for projectile drop, and you also have to be aiming for headshots because it has considerably higher headshot damage. Thing is, like in Doom Eternal, you have very limited ammo capacity for all of your weapons, and you're going to be needing to stop what you're doing to go find ammo pickups, or much more likely, go find an enemy which you can melee to death in order to get an ammo shower from them. That, of course, basically being the same principle as using the chainsaw in Doom Eternal. Problem with that is that the chainsaw in Doom Eternal just insta-killed whatever enemy you were going up against, and it would use a certain amount of fuel in order to do so. Whereas in Doom the Dark Ages, you just swing out with whatever your melee weapon is, and if it hits something, then it utilizes an ammo charge for it, and that may or may not be enough to take down that enemy. If you're using one of the weaker melee weapons, like the Gauntlet or the Flail, then it will likely take several hits in order to bring down that enemy, unless of course it's a fodder enemy. And if you're using the mace, which you get later on in the game, that's usually going to be a one-hit kill, or on the more tough enemies, it might take a couple of them. But that's going to come at the cost of only having one melee charge and taking a lot longer to replenish that charge compared to the Gauntlet or the Flail. Funny thing about that, though, is that if you set up your upgrades correctly throughout the entire game, you can basically trivialize the entire combat loop. A prime example for this is basically the Impaler loop, and why you see me using it so much, where the first upgrade you can get for it will allow you to replenish your ammo for the Impaler whenever you use your shield to do anything other than static block. The next upgrade you stack on top of that is that whenever you pick up ammo, it will buff your next shot to do considerably higher damage. And then the next upgrade after that is that when you get a headshot with the Impaler, it significantly contributes to recharging your melee. Combine this with the Dread Mace, the first upgrade for which will make enemies drop more health when you kill them with it, the second of which causes it to do more damage to enemies nearby the enemy you're attacking with it, and the third upgrade for which will give you a free melee swing if you parry an attack. Now combine this with an upgrade for your shield, which will give you a more powerful shockwave when you parry an attack, followed by the Ground Fissure rune, which will cause a large shockwave earthquake-style effect whenever you parry an attack, and that effect can further be upgraded to travel further, do more damage, and set enemies on fire and cause them to drop armor. So with this loadout, which is very easy to achieve, I might add, you will absolutely never run out of ammo, melee swings, armor, or health. And with a loadout that ridiculously good, there's really no incentive to use anything else unless there's certain enemies that are particularly susceptible to certain attacks. For example, the Impaler is not great against every single enemy. Some enemies are much more susceptible to being blasted with the super shotgun, whereas some others might have an energy shield that's better suited to being hit with plasma rounds, which will cause the shield to overload and then cause the enemy to explode. Some enemies are quite resilient to most attacks other than being charged with the shield, and some enemies have either a big heavy shield or some heavy armor plates that need to be damaged to superheat them, and then you need to knock the armor off by throwing your shield at them, which for the weaker shield-bearing enemies will just eviscerate them, but for enemies that have heavier armor, it'll knock the armor off and reveal the weak flesh underneath. But anyway, point is that even if you go up against some of these other enemies, there's very quick and easy ways to dispatch them, and then you can go right back to just using the Impaler all over again, and it pretty much trivializes the entire game. The only real difficulty you'll run into is that if you're playing on a higher difficulty setting, the enemies will do a lot of damage to you, and there's not really good feedback on how much damage you're really taking. So even though it's easy to replenish your health and armor, it's also easy to lose track of how much you've got, and that can lead to your untimely demise if you happen to run out of 1-ups. Because that feature from Doom Eternal returns, where you have extra lives. You can have a maximum of 3 extra lives, and as long as you have one of those, whenever your health bottoms out, you can spend it to instantly replenish your health to full, and you just go right back to it. And the game isn't exactly stingy with those extra lives either. There are a few secret areas scattered around the game, some of which are a bit trickier than others to get into and out of, but most of them aren't too difficult to find, and you're going to be seeking those out because that's how you're going to be getting the lion's share of gold, rubies, and wraith stones, which are your upgrade materials, but they also sometimes include extra lives or collectibles. But anyway, point is that if you're playing this game more or less the way it is intended, you're going to be going for secret areas, so you'll seldom find yourself without at least one of these extra lives, and again, this more or less trivializes the combat loop. But there's one aspect above all the others I've discussed thus far that really drags down the general combat loop, and that is its central mechanic, the shield. You see, a lot of people really couldn't handle how fast Doom Eternal could be. For me, it wasn't so much the speed of the game that was the problem, it was the constant switching back and forth to all the different weapons, all the different abilities, just because the game was designed in a way to where if you used anything but those one specific things to defeat specific enemy types, it would just drag everything out because you would be running out of ammo, you'd have to go find fodder enemies to chainsaw, and it just dragged the entire combat loop down. It was just generally mentally exhausting. Doom the Dark Ages gameplay loop was clearly designed as a response to criticisms of this method. And so your mobility is dramatically reduced. There's no more dashing at all, there's barely any jumping you can do. You can't do double jumping, you can't just jump up, grab onto bars and swing across with them or anything like that. It's all rather straightforward, actually. You play more like you would expect a Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine to play, where you're trudging forward and you're basically a humanoid tank. You're not trying to weave your way through the enemies, you are smashing your way through them, and the way you do this is with dramatically reduced movement speed, although it's still pretty fast compared to most other shooters, and much more importantly, the introduction of the shield. Now, the shield starts off with 3 basic abilities. The first is to hold it up and block incoming attacks. You can only do this for a limited amount of time before your shield meter depletes, and then you're unable to use the shield for a brief period while the shield meter recharges, after which you can bring it back up. A closely related mechanic to the blocking is the parrying system, where whenever an enemy attacks you with a glowing green attack, if you time your block well enough, then you will parry that incoming attack, and that will either reflect the attack back at the enemy if it's a projectile, or if it's a melee attack, then it'll create a small shock wave right in front of your shield that will stagger the enemy if it's a weak enough enemy anyway. The stronger enemies don't get staggered immediately, they might take multiple parries to do that. And a successful parry will also cause the game to go very briefly into slow-mo and also will not reduce your shield meter. The other mechanic the shield starts with is the shield charge, where you hold the shield out in front of you and it will give you an automatic targeting system, and whenever you find the enemy you want to charge, then you just press the attack button while you're also holding the shield button, and you will do a forward charging maneuver which will smash the weaker enemies into paste, and to the tougher enemies it will do some damage to them. It might stagger them if they're weak enough, but if they're not weak enough then it won't stagger them. And for one specific type of enemy in the game, it is the most efficient way to defeat them, because if you charge them with a shield, then it will turn them into paste, and if you use any other method, then it will likely take several hits to bring them down. You can also use the shield charge to smash your way through environmental obstacles, and in fact this is done quite frequently throughout the game, both to progress normally and to also access secret areas. Not very long after this, you will get an upgrade for your shield which will attach a chainsaw blade to the rim of the shield, And at that point, you can throw your shield at enemies to either stun them if it's a tougher enemy, or to simply eviscerate weaker enemies. You can also throw it at anything that is superheated, meaning that it's glowing orange, and that will sever or shatter whatever that object is. So if it's a chain holding up, say, a crate, then it will snap the chain and the crate will fall. If it's a chunk of armor on a tougher enemy, then it will knock that armor plating off. And if it's an enemy who's holding a shield out in front of them, then it will destroy both the shield and the guy holding it. And if there are a bunch of guys next to him, it'll also take all of them out. Now these are all of the main mechanics behind the shield, and they're also used to solve what passes for puzzles in this game, where you might have to smash through a barrier that's slightly hidden with the shield charge, or you might have to throw the shield at a dangling superheated chain in order to drop a crate or something like that that'll either activate a switch or place the crate in a position where you can then shield charge into it to knock it into position, and then you can use that to scramble up to some other place. Or you throw the shield at the blatantly glowing green, goo-dripping torso sticking out of a wall somewhere, and then you press the button again to jump up to the platform that will connect you to. Or you shield charge into the glowing green ring in order to launch yourself a far distance. Or you just throw the shield at some other superheated object in the environment to shatter it or to cause a chain reaction or something like that. And that's it. I say what passes for puzzles because every single one of them is so brain dead simple you have to expend basically no brain power to actually solve it. At least you won't have to if you have an IQ higher than that of a concussed amoeba anyway. And the only real difficulty you'll ever have in actually figuring out a way forward is just figuring out where they have tucked away the path to get to where you need to go in order to get to some secret area or something like that. And since they dramatically reduce your mobility compared to Doom Eternal, there's none of the platforming challenges that you would come across that were in Doom Eternal, which is an improvement to some degree because those always felt wildly out of place in Doom Eternal. It's just that they didn't really replace them with anything interesting. Just some more open level design that requires you to flip switches or go and fight enemies in arenas that will close off when you enter them or things like that. Basically the stuff you were already doing anyway and which will gradually wear out its welcome over the course of the game. Regardless, almost all of this relies almost exclusively on the shield. And with how much the shield and melee systems are emphasized in this game, it's really hard to shake the feeling that you're playing a first-person brawler rather than a first-person shooter, and that just makes it feel all kinds of wrong for a Doom game. I mean, after all, the original Doom is the father of the entire first-person shooter genre, so if the gameplay isn't centered primarily around the guns, it just doesn't really feel right. And that's something that has kind of plagued the reboots in general, between how much emphasis is put on the glory kills, the melee finishers, and in this particular game, the shield. It just never really feels like a Doom game. It also doesn't help that the level design just doesn't feel remotely Doomy. At best, it feels like the level design from the previous two games, both of which did not feel like Doom games in their level design either. They felt like Serious Sam, where you would basically be going from combat arena to combat arena connected by hallways, although in this particular case, there's more wide open level design. It's just that it still tends to resolve in combat arenas connected by more open space. It's just an odd way to design the levels, and while it never really tanks the experience or anything, it doesn't really benefit it either. It just feels like they just threw that in there because open-ended level design or open world gameplay tested well with a focus group, so they decided, you know what, we're just gonna make it more open, I guess. And if the levels themselves were just more open-ended, then that would be one thing, but the way they've designed the encounters within those levels is just downright pitiful. Things do ramp up very slightly when you get towards the end of the game, and it's throwing all the enemy types at you all at once. But by and large, most encounters are pretty much a joke. You'll have one or two larger, more powerful enemies, and then a whole bunch of fodder enemies that constantly spawn in while the encounter is active, just running around being a general nuisance. And in a pathetic attempt to make you feel like a badass, they'll throw a bunch of shield enemies up, where the first one has their shield superheated already before you even do anything, so they're completely trivialized. You just chuck your shield at them, you take all of them out with a single shield throw, then you just go right back to whatever else you were doing. Or they'll throw you into a more tightly enclosed space and then just start throwing a whole bunch of Hell Knights at you, because clearly Hell Knights are scary, right? Except in this game they're not, because you parry their attacks and they're a complete joke. At absolutely no point during the entire game was there a single combat encounter I can actually describe as memorable. Everything just becomes a blur of completely demolishing all of the trash mobs, and then when the handful of tougher enemies show up, actually spending a couple of moments to put some focused fire on them, which takes them down quite quickly, and maybe at best they spice up the encounter by having one particular enemy buffing all the other ones, so you need to take that one out in order to reduce the amount of tedium you have fighting with all the other ones, or they'll have a sort of leader-type enemy, which is one of the ones where if you take them down, then you get the actual glory kill animation on them, and you increase either your health, armor, or ammo. But in order to actually be able to damage them, you have to defeat their minions first, so you just have to slaughter an arbitrary amount of the other demons that are constantly spawning in while this other guy is just sitting here impervious to all damage. And once you've defeated that arbitrary number, then their shield meter depletes, and now you can actually do damage to them. And while there are certainly plenty of particle effects flashing up on the screen, there's chunks being blasted out of enemies, and they're flying apart as you eviscerate them and such, none of that actually matters, because when everything is trivialized like this, you don't feel like a badass for overcoming any challenges or anything like that. You just feel like you're doing a bunch of tedious chores. It is outright boring, and that is the absolute worst sin a video game can commit. If gameplay is good or well designed, then it will be engaging, interesting, maybe even exhilarating, whereas if it's badly enough designed, then it will be frustrating and irritating, or even outright hilarious in how bad it is. But all a boring game manages to do is make you feel either absolutely nothing at all, or make you just feel like you're wasting your time and you would be better served doing pretty much anything else, and that is exactly what happens with the general gameplay experience of Doom: The Dark Ages. It's only made worse when they try to spice up the gameplay slightly by introducing sections where you fly around on the dragon, or you're stomping around in a mech. Because those sections are just so pathetically underdeveloped that they may as well not even be in the game at all. When you're flying the dragon, you can shoot at things while chasing them, you can lock onto things and shoot at them, and maybe dodge incoming attacks, which are telegraphed with massive green particle effects, making it hilariously easy to figure out what they are, and you can increase the speed at which you move forward. At the end of the day, it's really just a vehicle to get you from combat arena to combat arena, so you can go from tedious gameplay section to other tedious gameplay section, with some tedious gameplay in between. And then the mech sections, I mean, when you look at the Atlan's in the rebooted Doom series, they look like they should be awesome. They're these giant stompy robots. Who doesn't love giant stompy robots? Well, when you actually get one, you find that all you're really doing is moving up to the Titan-type enemies and punching them to build up your combo meter, and then pressing another button to unleash the combo that you've built up on that enemy and probably take them out with it. The only way they try to spice this up a bit later on is by introducing a shoulder cannon that will give you an extra ability with the combo meter. So you start out with a shockwave stomp that takes up one section of the meter, and then a palm strike which takes up the other section of the meter. And then when you get later on into the game and get the shoulder cannon one, then if you let the combo meter build up all the way, you can unleash a cannon strike, which might sound cool, but it's remarkably lame in action. But the only other way they try to spice this up is that they will give you a giant minigun to shoot the Titans with, and that's it. It's the kind of thing that just leaves you sitting there wondering why they even bothered to include a section like that in the game, and more importantly, they do it a couple of times throughout the entire campaign, and they do the same thing with the dragon flying sequences. They're meant to be sort of like in, say, mid-2000s first-person shooters, where you would have a level where you're in a vehicle, or a level where you're doing just a turret sequence the entire level, or something like that, meant to break up the general gameplay experience slightly, but rather than spice up the game with some variety, it only makes it even more tedious and boring, and that's just the end result of the entire experience playing through Doom the Dark Ages. None of it is so poorly designed that I would go so far as to say it is an outright awful game, because you can play through the entire thing, and generally speaking, everything is going to at least function. I did run into one really weird instance where I fell off of a ledge during one of the levels, and then it respawned me at a previous point where I couldn't actually get out of it, so it soft-locked me, but that was fixed with restarting at a previous checkpoint. And it only happened that once, so as weird and irritating as it was in the moment, it's not really something I would consider to be a major concern. It's just a bit sloppy. And anyway, point is that the game in general is functional. If you're looking for an action game of some sort, then, well, Doom the Dark Ages is an action game. It's just not a fun one. It's not a good follow-up to Doom 2016 or Doom Eternal. In actual mechanics, it really just doesn't feel much like a Doom game at all. All of the action is completely trivialized, both by the upgrade system and by how overly reliant on the shield all of the gameplay is. You never really come up against combat encounters that are truly challenging. At absolute best, they just throw a whole bunch of enemies at you all at once and overwhelm you with the amount of damage coming in. Basically just capitalizing on the reduced mobility that you have in Dark Ages compared to Eternal, so you can't just get out of the way of attacks anymore. You have to use the shield, and gameplay centered around that just isn't fun. The sections that are meant to spice up gameplay only make it even more tedious, and the end result of all of this is a game that dramatically overstays its welcome. It's about 12-ish hours long, depending on what difficulty setting you're playing on, and how much you go after the secrets and such. And while that would ordinarily be a bit long for a first-person shooter single-player campaign, in this game it just drags on and on and on with its just garbage storyline and mediocre, boring gameplay. And something else I haven't even mentioned is the soundtrack, which is more along the lines of what I would actually really want from a Doom soundtrack, being proper heavy metal soundtrack style. But the problem is that they went for such a generic, simplistic version of a heavy metal soundtrack that while it doesn't have the obnoxious electronic noise effect that Mick Gordon's soundtrack in the 2016 reboot, and to a lesser extent the soundtrack of Doom Eternal had, it's all just such generic heavy metal backing track that you barely even notice it most of the time. It is completely indistinct, and it doesn't sound like Doom. I mean, I can't think of a single callback to classic Doom music here, and not a single track that really stands out, other than simply the one they used in the trailer, which is Unchained Predator. And even that sounds incredibly generic. The sad part here is that I would take the obnoxious electronic noise of Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal over what is present in Doom the Dark Ages, even though what is present in Doom the Dark Ages is more in keeping with the actual metal music that I like, simply because the soundtracks of Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal at least sound relatively unique. They sound like at least new Doom music, even if they don't sound like classic Doom music. At least Mick actually used some riffs and beats from original Doom music as a sort of callback to the classics, rather than the painfully generic heavy metal riffs and beats that awkwardly fill background space in Doom the Dark Ages. And unlike with Doom Eternal, it doesn't even actually run all that well thanks to forcing ray tracing on you, so the whole thing just comes across as a game that doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. It's just trying to appeal to a wider audience than Doom Eternal did, which Doom Eternal really only appeals to a very small niche of NuDOOM fans and not many others. But of course, by trying to cast this broader net, they've ended up with something that just isn't really made for anybody. It's basically just more Game Pass slop. Something that is way too expensive to buy on its own. It's $70 US or your regional equivalent if you actually wanted to buy the game outright. But if you're playing the game on Game Pass, it doesn't feel like anywhere near as much of a loss. It's still absolutely wasting your time, and that time would be way better spent on pretty much anything else, honestly. But at least you don't have the downright insult of having paid $70 US for the privilege of such a mediocre, tedious mess of a game. And that just seems to be Microsoft's strategy in general these days. They don't seem to care about actually releasing quality games that people want to buy and play. Rather, they're just shoveling out increasingly mediocre or worse slop onto Game Pass and just getting away with it because if you're paying for a Game Pass subscription, at least it's not paying $70 US for the privilege of playing a mediocre or worse game. Of course, very soon it's not even going to be $70 US, it's going to be $80 US. The Outer Worlds 2 is already slated to be $80 US, which is downright insane for a game like that. But that's where the industry is going these days, continually increasing prices for weaker and weaker products. Well, the end result is the likes of Doom: The Dark Ages. A playable at best experience that I would not recommend to anyone, because your time and money would just be far better spent on pretty much anything else. And ultimately, even though this isn't my typical review format, I did ultimately finish the game, so I feel obligated to summarize it all with a score on my review scale. And on my scale, ultimately, it's a 2 out of 5. It's not badly enough designed that I would outright describe it as an awful game or anything like that, but it's just such subpar, tedious slop that I can't recommend it to anybody either. There are just so many other games out there that are far more worth your time and money, many of which are going to be considerably cheaper than this, even on Game Pass, and you should just spend your time and money on those instead. Thank you all very much for watching and for bearing with me on how rambly this video turned out to be. And in case you can't tell by the tone of this entire video, I am extremely tired of modern slop, so I am going to take a bit of a break from covering the most modern games, so that I can go find something that might actually be made for an audience that exists, rather than just the modern audience that the industry keeps chasing and seemingly cannot find. So thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.